Hello everyone, welcome to our new video in R programming. In this video we will talk about for loops in R programming. So let's get started. Basically in a loop we repeat a specified code, a block of code, while we increment an index or a counter, and we will see the for loop and while loop in this part. So let's start with some example with the for loop. So we will write for, and then we will have parentheses. Let's say we have my item in. So we use the in keyword here, and we will go over, let's say, these 5, 6, and 7 as the values of my item, and then we put our curly parentheses, and let's say we want to execute a few lines of code. Maybe we might just do some print statements. Okay, so let's write something here. And then we can do a new line and we print this statement. We can print another statement. And then we will display my item, the value of this one. And then we put another comma and put another new line here. And let's say finally we print area ends. Okay, and then put another new line. Okay, so this is a simple for loop that we created, and we can run it and see what it gives us. So we have my item first assigned to the first value equals to 5, and we just print these statements with my item, the current item value as 5, and then we move on to 6 and 7. So we repeat this printing operation as we go over these iterations. And similarly, we can also use a counter. Usually in a loop, we might have a counter as well. And in a loop, we might increment this counter. And let's say again we have 5 to 7. But this time we can increment our counter, adding 1 every time. And then we can display something on the screen. The item in run, let's say counter, and then we say is my item, and we put a new line here. Okay, so you can test it, and you will see we get these counter values, and the value of my item is also displayed. Now let's do another example. Now we create a vector, let's say my vector. We create with some arbitrary values, so you can change these numbers. Let's say 0.9. So we can have our for loop, and let's say our index variable is just I. So this index variable you can use any name that is meaningful for your code, but it just makes sure it doesn't overlap with some other keywords. And then we can go over the elements of this vector this time. So I will be taking the elements of this vector one by one in this for loop. We put a parenthesis here, and let's print this time 2 times the value of this I. So we can do many different types of like arithmetic operations, or write some other chunks of code here. And in this example, we are simply multiplying this I values with 2, and we want to display them. So if we run it, you will see we multiply each element by 2 and print it on the screen. Alternatively, we can also write our for loop by saying I from 1 to the, let's say, length of my vector here. Okay. Again, as usual, we put our parentheses, and then we can this time print 2 times my vector and the ith element. So as you see, instead of, the previous example, we were going through the values of my vector directly by assigning this I, but this time we are accessing the elements of my vector by the index. So instead of going over the elements directly, we are indexing and iterating over these index values and access the vector's element by the index. So these two examples show this difference to us, and you see we get the same result in two different ways. Okay, so we can let's look at another example. We can also nest actually the loops. So for example, we can have my vector, let's say 1. Let's create again some arbitrary values here. And we can have my vector 2. And let's go again create another vector with some arbitrary values. Okay. And then we can have our first for loop, let's say I in 1 to length of my vector 1. And then we put our parentheses. Now we are going to have another for loop. Let's say this time our index, we call it as j, and 1 to length my vector 2. And we put our parentheses here. So this time we can, let's say, we can multiply, let's say, the elements of my vector 1 indexed by I, and then let's say we multiply that with my vector 2 indexed by j, and we can print these. Okay, so we can see that we go over different I and j values from 1 to the length of the first vector, which has 5 elements, so we will have 5 times going over this index I, and then we have j from, again, we have 4 elements in this one, so we have from 1 to 4 for j, so they will be giving us the values of the second vector. So we can do such an example. You can also have a matrix, and then you can also work with the matrices. So for example, if we create a matrix, let's say with NA values, and let's say it is 3 by 3, so we can display that. So this is a 3 by 3 matrix, or you can fill this matrix with some values, but for us, just to demonstrate, to use it in an example, we have another for loop, let's say j in 1 to 3, and we can basically for example, assign some values to our matrix. And let's assign some random numbers. and let's say assign one of them at a time. So by using this function, we are actually generating some random uniform numbers every time, and suppose we want to assign these values to our matrix, and then we can print our matrix here. Okay, so as you can see, we are filling our matrix with some random numbers using this function here. You can, of course, do many other operations, whatever you want. It's just an example here. So this is about the for loops. That's all about for our for loops. Next, we will talk about the while loops. In the while loops, we need to have a loop condition, and then we will execute some code within our parentheses as usual. So let's do some simple examples. So let's say my value equals to 5, and we have the while statement now. My value, let's say, less than 10. So if this condition is true, whatever code we have written in these curly parentheses, it will be executed. It will continue to execute. So if this condition is always true, I mean, you will continuously be running the code inside this inside the while loop. Okay, so you need to be careful and don't forget to increment your variable here. Otherwise, you get an infinite loop. So that's something you need to be careful. So let's say we increment this my value. We start with 5, and every time we can increment it by 1, and then once my value becomes 10, this statement will be false. So we will get out of the while loop here. Okay. Again, you can have several lines of code here to execute whatever operation is needed, and we just want to display, let's say, something again. And let's say my val is now equals to this value, and then we put another new line. And we can add something like my we can say condition is now my value less than 10. So we can check whether this is a true statement or not at every iteration. So if you run this, you can see how each iteration and then what do we execute under this while condition. So my value, if we have this one equals to 6 now, after we increment by 1, it is 6. So the condition is true. And then we move on to 7, 8, the condition is still true. We have 9, the condition is true. And then finally, once we come to 10, my value is equal to 10, this condition is false. So that will be that will give us the end of our basically while loop. And let's do one more example, and then we will conclude this video. Suppose we have a list. We create an empty list first, and then we have a counter, and let's give some arbitrary vector of numbers. We create a vector, let's say 4, 5, 1, 2, 6. Okay, and then my condition less than or equal to 5. So we will put my condition here. So the counter we increment as usual, counter plus 1, and we will put also, let's say, an if statement. And as you see, in a while loop we can also have nested statements, we can have conditional statements, or any other code that you want to execute. And let's say in this if condition we want to check the counter is less than the length of my numbers, and then we have the curly brackets as usual, and we have the my condition now equals to my numbers counter, let's say less than or equal to 5. So let's have the else part, and in the else part my condition is false. So if this is true, I mean if this is a true statement, my condition will be a true statement, otherwise it's going to be a false statement. And if this my condition is true, then we will continue to execute this while loop actually. So if we look at again going over this, we have created an empty list first. We set our counter to 1 at the beginning, and then we have an arbitrary a vector of numbers, and then basically for the first value of my condition it is initialized here. So let's first run this part and see, and then we have here my condition, and we can see my condition, this is true. So once it is true at the beginning, it will start to get in this while loop and start the execution. Okay, if this was not true, then we will not be able to start our while loop, because if it is false it will get out and it will not run the code inside. So this is true, so our code will continue with this line, and here we have the, so let's say my numbers counter equals to 1. So you can see it creates an identity matrix with, so we are filling this list with different matrices. So the first matrix is given, and then we continue to fill it until basically my condition is false. Once this is false, we will stop the execution and get out of the while loop. So in this example, we are utilizing several things together, including a conditional statement and creating a list. So we have these more complex operations together. And we can check my list. So as you see, we have created 10 identity matrices since we executed our while loop. Okay, so I think that's all for our examples on the for loop and while loops. And then in the next video we will continue with writing functions. Thank you for watching.